Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War Update Extra video, giving you extra tidbits and nuggets to give you a greater understanding of the war in Ukraine. And actually today, the elections in the UK. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking only on this whole Nigel Farage incident that's happened with regard to his views on Putin, Russia and the war in Ukraine. I didn't want to derail my geopolitical video later because I was going to talk about this again, and I've done that now for something like 3 days in a row. So I need to just purge myself of these ideas and thoughts by doing a separate one. So sorry, not sorry. Okay, let's remind ourselves, for those who don't know, first of all, who's Nigel Farage? And Nigel Farage is in charge of I would say, the Reform UK party, but it's actually not an electoral party. It's set up as a company, which is interesting in itself. So the first thing to say about Nigel Farage is, he quite likes, I think, autocracy there. Like, he is the sole kind of leader. He's not accountable to anyone. He's not elected into the position. There's no internal Reform UK party structure that means that people are voted into. There's no democracy inside it. It's his own. It's a private company, and therefore it has slightly different rules. Well, it does have to adhere to certain electoral regulations, but it is a very different kettle of fish, and he has just complete control over that. So that's interesting in and of itself, because I think that's somewhat reflective of what his ideals were. If I was to start a political party, or a political enterprise, some political project, I'd be putting democracy right at the centre of it, because that's what I stand for and that's what I believe in. And it's evident that he doesn't particularly believe in that because of the way he structured the party that he is in charge of. Anyway, it's at the moment running at 17% of the polling averages, where the Conservatives are at 20%. And as I've told you before, the Reform Party is absolutely destroying the Conservative Party's chance of not just not getting a hung parliament out of Labour, but just is destroying their chances of even getting a decent amount of seats. Yeah, Conservatives are looking like they're going to be decimated. Now, my view is that the Labour victory won't be the landslide many people think it will, because I think a lot of Labour's vote will be taken. But I think it will be taken by Reform. So I think Reform are now starting because of Nigel Farage, not because of Reform. As soon as Nigel Farage came back in, you find people on the streets talking about who you're going to vote for. They don't say Reform. They say, I'm going to vote for Nigel Farage, even though he's not standing in their constituency. This is very much a one-person party where people see him as some kind of knight in shining armour that's going to solve the boat problem of people coming across the channel. And that is evident in the constituency that I live in. And Novara Media went around my constituency, or actually the next one over. I'm technically in the borough council of this particular constituency. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But Novara Media went around there and spoke to people, and everyone is super angry with the Conservatives, but they're angry in my particular neck of the woods, not from a left-leaning position against the Conservatives, but actually sitting further to the right, saying you should have done more about immigration. We're going to vote for Nigel Farage because the Tories have been a disgrace, but we're angry from further to the right. Now, I know a certain number of my viewers were going to vote for Reform and said, actually, due to his Ukraine positioning, I'm thinking about not doing that anymore. And I would congratulate that kind of positioning. I think he's particularly dangerous. We're going to talk about that now. But just from a political point of view, the situation is Reform are really damaging the Conservatives, but I think will also damage Labour as well, especially since Labour, the left vote is already split between Labour, Lib Dems, Green, and either SNP or Plaid Cymru, depending on whether you're in Scotland or Wales, and just with the Greens and Lib Dem in England. So the Labour Party has a really difficult job getting into Parliament anyway, forming a majority government, because they get their votes split all the time, which is why this election was looking particularly rosy for Labour, because Reform have come along and are looking to split the Conservative vote explicitly for the first time in electoral history. I think the right wing, or certainly in the last 100 years, the right wing has been so obviously split. But now that I think Reform, or Nigel Farage more particularly, is taking working class voters off Labour, I think it could be quite interesting. Now, because of first past the post voting system, actually Reform will hardly return any or the voting will hardly return any reform MPs. It will be just a handful of MPs. But I think possibly could be a few more than we initially thought, because I think there is a surge for Nigel Farage's Reform Party. However, he's then gone and said what he said the other day. So let's remind ourselves of what he said before we look at a little bit more analysis.
I stood up in the European Parliament in 2014 and I said, and I quote, "There will be a war in Ukraine." Why did I say that?
Sorry to interrupt, but it's really important that we understand these bits as they come. So just that you predicted a war means nothing. I mean, well done you. Well done, you predicted something. I'm more interested in why, but he does often talk about, he'll stand up and say, "I was the one that predicted it. I was the one that predicted it." In these speeches he's making at the moment, it's like, okay, well, bully for you. I mean, other people were also talking about the growing crisis out there, but it's about the causality that's involved that's important here, and you've got it wrong.
It was obvious to me that the ever eastward expansion of NATO and the European Union was giving this man a reason to his Russian people to say they're coming for us again and to go to war.
But you were echoing him.
Sorry?
You were echoing him. That's what Putin says.
No. Sorry, I've been saying this actually since the 1990s. Ever since the fall of the wall. But hang on a second. We've provoked this war. It's, of course it's his fault.
And as I've said before, this is the problem with Farage here, is he's trying to have his cake and eat it as well. He's trying to say we provoked them. It's EU's and the NATO's fault that the war in Ukraine started. And then he says, obviously, that exonerates Putin. So it was ultimately Putin's fault. But it was us what did it. And of course, this is wrong. And we'll look at this now, because part of what this video is about is the claim that there is EU and NATO expansion and that the agency came from the EU and NATO and not from these other countries is deeply problematic, and it strips these other nations from their agency. So, for example, Armenia the other day said in Parliament for the first time ever they want to join the EU. That's not EU expansionism. That's a country over there that the EU is sort of keeping an eye on, but there's other things going on, that have stood up and said, yeah, we're thinking about joining the EU now. Now, that's what he would understand as expansionism. Now, you've got to understand something really, really important here. And that is that Nigel Farage deeply, deeply, deeply hates the EU. So everything needs to be seen through that lens. And so if there's going to be any involvement of the EU in anything in the world, anything that the EU is involved in the world, it is bad if the EU wants it. Right? Because he's so deeply Eurosceptical. So that you would have countries wanting to go to the EU. He cannot see that as something that these countries would want, because he wouldn't want it. Goodness me. Heaven forfend. Any entity would ever want to join the EU. It's this disgusting partnership of countries that it's X, Y, and Z. That's what he thinks, and so he can't understand that. So therefore, it has to be then grasping at these countries and pulling them towards them. And of course, you need to understand, or he needs to understand more pertinently, that Ukraine in 2014 saw the Euromaidan uprising of people who saw their future dashed by Yanukovych, who reneged on his agreement to go more westwards towards the EU and talk about accession to the EU, went back on his agreement with the population, and they rose up and protested against that because they wanted to join the EU. This wasn't about the EU grasping them and pulling them. This was about what those young people, predominantly at the beginning, the students and young people, and eventually the nation as a whole came together to strive for that ideal and for that future for themselves. But it wasn't EU expansionism like he would have you believe.
He's used what
But we provoked the invasion of Ukraine. Yes, and very interestingly, once again, 10 years ago when I predicted this, by the way, I'm the only person in British politics that predicted what would happen. And of course, everyone said I was a pariah for daring to suggest it. George Robertson, former Labour cabinet minister, who went on to become the Secretary General of NATO, has in the last couple of weeks said the war is a direct result of EU expansionism. But I'm asking you about, because it's your judgment, you want to be Prime Minister. Let me ask you about someone else.
My judgment has been way ahead of everybody else's in understanding this.
Okay, and so let's have a look at a few ideas here. But before we go into look at NATO expansionism, let's look at Farage a little bit more. But again, before we do that, let's just correct that final claim he made about Lord Robertson. So the Shropshire Star here has done a fact check. Former NATO chief did not say that EU expansion provoked Putin. And this is disingenuous and essentially a lie from Farage. So Lord Robertson said that Vladimir Putin, quote, is not bothered about NATO or NATO enlargement. Nigel Farage said the expansion of NATO and the EU provoked Russian President Putin into invading Ukraine. In a speech on June the 24th, the Reform UK leader addressed those comments and claimed they were supported by views of Lord Robertson, the former Secretary General of NATO. Lord Robertson had previously said of Putin in an interview with the New Statesman that, quote, Putin's not bothered about NATO or NATO enlargement. So that's actually quite different. He also said, quote, the whole Ukraine crisis started with the offer of an EU accession agreement to Ukraine in 2014. So that's not to say that the offer of the EU accession agreement was either expansionist or was like a necessary causality, although it's kind of in this whole larger, I guess, chronology of events, but it's not got the agency like Putin has in invading another country, right? This is part of the foundation of the decisions that were made thereafter was built upon. But I don't think it has any kind of moral culpability, the sort of which Farage is talking about here. And this is where you get a difference between, I don't want to get too philosophical here, but difference between different understandings of what causality is and reasons and causal explanations and so on and so forth. But anyway, just to continue here, Lord Robertson added that the EU was, quote, not at fault and has since said that Mr. Farage is, quote, parroting the Kremlin line. So this is just a bit of a problem that unfortunately Farage is parroting that stuff. Now let's go back to look at a little bit of Farage. Like I said, it's worth going back to 2014 when Nigel Farage said that the leader he admires most is Putin, right? Putin is the leader I admire most. Now, let's be honest to Farage here, it was a slightly more nuanced quote. So asked by Tony Blair's former Director of Communications, Alistair Campbell, in an interview in GQ magazine, which current world leader he most admired, Mr. Farage replied, as an operator, but not as a human being, I would say Putin. The way he played the whole Syria thing, brilliant. Not that I approve of him politically. How many journalists in jail now? Mr. Putin has been criticised for supplying arms to Bashar al-Assad's regime and his attempts to block United Nations moves for sanctions against the Syrian president. However, the Russian leader was credited with outmanoeuvring the West last year when he brokered a deal for Syria to give up its chemical weapons. So what he's saying basically is he admires Putin for being able to outmanoeuvre the West in terms of the use of chemical weapons and the way that, I don't know, it's just, if I was asked who in the political world I admire the most, I'd be looking at who represents the most successful manifestation of democratic values. And yet, where Farage goes is who's managed to wield their power in the most successful way for the advantage of that person. In other words, who's the most cynically powerful. And it goes back to this idea that that Farage is running not a political party that's involved in democratic processes, but he's running his own private enterprise where he is the leader, and he looks at other leaders. And this is very Trumpian. Trump looks at Kim Jong-un and Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin and says, and Viktor Orban, these are the people I admire. And I admire them for the way that they are able to use their power. This is exactly where Farage is coming from here. And the parallels, I think, are really obvious for us to see. Then it's worth reminding ourselves that Farage has previously been paid by Russian state propaganda. He's been paid by Russia Today. Now, I know in 2017, he was accused of taking £548,000 from RT by Chris Bryant, the Labour MP. That was not true. He had taken £548,000 for all media appearances, which may have included RT in it. And even that was at the end of his time of appearing a lot on RT. I don't know whether he's had paid appearances since since 2017. But certainly before that, I mean, here we've got him. This is so cringe, but I have to show it. And this is when RT was trying to set up in the UK and in Europe and have their own little shows in each country in studios.
The one thing that we feel that you have been dreaming of secretly all your life, that is an honorary news thing, knighthood, Nigel. So
wow.
Bring in Her Majesty. It's time to knight Mr. Farage. If you would like to kneel there.
Come on then. Don't hurt me. Well, thank you.
You are now Sir Nigel Farage.
And of course, that's incredibly cringe. But, you know, Farage was a frequent appearer on RT and being paid by them. So, again, we have connections to Russia. Then I talked you through the Byline Times superb piece from about a week ago now that talked about his connections to the Russian ambassador leading up to, I think, the Brexit referendum. And then we had his connections to Aaron Banks, who's a funder of Leave.eu, and Aaron Banks's connection to Russian money and whether Russian money was backing the Leave.eu campaign, and all sorts of reports that haven't been forthcoming on Russian interference with Brexit, because the Conservative government didn't want to do a report on that because they knew it would play merry havoc with undermining that Brexit vote once people understood how much Russia were interfering. And then the question about his knowledge of the hacking campaign for Hillary Clinton from Russia, and being blind to Steve Bannon and Trump's backing for Russia, even though he basically parrots exactly the same rhetoric as those two. And then finally, hiding the assessment that his Leave.eu campaign funder was an agent of Russian influence, which is, as I was telling you with regard to Aaron Banks and other connections to the Leave.eu campaign, so on and so forth. So there's lots of connections that either Farage definitely has, or that just haven't been cleared up, and it's rather murky to Russia. Now, as soon as Nigel Farage said the things he did, he was praised by Russian state media. There's a brilliant interview on Times Radio just now where they got in the previous advisor to Putin in a live chat, and actually he was getting really angry. He was saying basically that Putin is Farage is 30% right, and we condone that, and 70% wrong. In other words, the bits where he said that Russia invaded and blah blah blah, they want to he's not right there, but he was right in the fact that it's EU and NATO expansionism. Of course, we can go back to 2014 when Russia and the Little Green Men invaded, in that illegal invasion of the Donbass and Crimea, and annexed those parts of the country. They didn't mention, and there was no rhetoric around at the time about NATO expansionism. NATO expansionism came later, and even in that 7,000-word essay that Putin released before the invasion of Ukraine, NATO was mentioned very little in that. There was not this sense of NATO expansionism there. It's become what we call a post hoc rationalization, which is an after-the-fact rationalization. It's a useful tool for Putin to be able to use to try and convince the West that it's their fault. But actually, at the time, it was all about getting Ukraine back into the fold of this expansionist. Expansionist the other way, is Putin's idea of becoming Peter the Great. Is about looking back in history and seeing the great era, as he would see it, of Russian history, and saying that's what I want back. Ukraine was part of that. It's essentially the essence of Russia includes Ukraine. They are brothers, but it doesn't really mean that in any humane way, because he's bombing the crap out of them and killing them ten a penny. So you've got that element. You've got the idea that Crimea is insanely important for strategic influence operations through the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean Sea with the Russian Navy. Okay, so all of these other reasons, we know that Putin is the natural resources, so on and so forth. So there are these reasons that he invades, and also there's this correlation between when his popularity starts dipping, he invades Georgia, Chechnya, Ukraine. It's a very interesting correlation. Bill Browder points this out on a Times radio interview just yesterday, I think. NATO expansionism is not really a thing. Evidently, a thing. It's become a rationale that's being used by Putin and people who are kind of pro Kremlin or anti-Ukraine, but it wasn't evidently a thing at those times, 2014 or 2022. And then we look at the EU and think, well, actually, these are countries that want to join the EU. If you're someone like Montenegro spending 14 years to get into the EU, like, and certain countries you've spent so long not even there yet, then it doesn't look like the EU is going around grasping countries. There's very much a strategy going on there. And of course, Ukraine will be a useful member of the EU for lots of strategic and economic reasons. But then the EU's not going around like stealing countries. Countries go to them. Look at what happened at the end of the Warsaw Pact when the dissolution, 1991. Those countries went to NATO voluntarily, like, we're out of this, and remember, NATO is a defensive pact, so it's not attacking people, it's a defensive pact, and it relies on countries voluntarily coming to them, right, which is not this kind of expansionism that Putin and indeed Farage is trying to express. You had these nations freely going to NATO and saying, we want to be a member of you. We were forced to be a part of Warsaw Pact. So that's a very different kettle of fish there. We're out of that and we're going straight to you guys. And this was an argument that was run through at the beginning of the 2022, the conflict in 2022, when lots of people were blaming NATO. People like Mearsheimer was coming on the radio and other people coming on saying, hey, hang on, that is actually wrong. That's not what happened. And this whole idea that Gorbachev agreed that there should not be any eastward expansion beyond East Germany. And of course, he came out in 2014 and said that never happened. So Gorbachev denied that, said there was no agreement of the sort, but yet that's still perpetrated by Putin and Putin fanboys like Farage. I would argue that that's where he is. And so there wasn't this NATO expansionism, wasn't an EU expansionism. Like, there is an expansion of the EU, but it's not an EU expansionist program that's being carried out. And I think I would want to play you all of this. This is such a good conversation between John Sopel, Lewis Goodall and Emily Maitlis on the Newsagents podcast. I do like the Newsagents. Anyway, they have a good chat about, and we're going to dip into this for quite a long time.
Which is to double down, which is to say election interference. I'm sorry, at the closest, we are 3,000 miles nearer to Ukraine than the eastern seaboard of the United States of America. It seems much more real. It seemed much more clear that there was an invasion taking place that was unprovoked. And the fact of the matter is that when those countries came out of totalitarian rule at the end of the Soviet Union, it wasn't expansionism where the EU was trying to take them over. Those countries wanted to join the European Union to have a bulwark of democracy, the rule of law, free elections like we have in the West.
Yeah, look,
that was the driving force.
NATO, if you want to go back, NATO has expanded, I think, 12 times or so since, the 1950s, in 2004 and 2009, after the sort of end of the Cold War. 2019, I think, was North Macedonia. They started talking about accession for other countries then as well. But you've talked about the criticism that Farage doesn't like. And I think it's important to also say that he has received compliments, actually, for what he said, for showing enlightenment and sanity. And that has come from, just checking notes, from Russia State Media. So they've been very, very happy that he has actually put the record straight on this one. I mean, look, I think two things are possible. If you want to have a very intense discussion about the expansion of NATO and about the position, that is a separate one. But I don't get the sense that this is what Farage is doing here. I think, as you said, he's trying to get the UK into the same place as MAGA Republicans are for Trump, which is starting to soften the ground for, do we really want to spend taxpayers' money on foreign wars? And
so this is where we're going to start moving the conversation from Farage being empirically wrong. So I could bore you with lots more information about how the NATO expansionism as a defensive organisation just makes no sense, and he's empirically wrong there, and it's not what provoked the war. And the EU expansionism is also not a thing that he declares it is. That was his provocation. Now, because it might be that Putin was annoyed at countries wanting to join the EU, and that caused him to want to invade. But that's on Putin, because that's the free democratic will of that country, in this case Ukraine, deciding to go westwards and not go towards the sphere of influence of Russia. And if that provoked him, that's more to do with his ability to be provoked by something that is the free will of another nation, right? So there are different understandings of provoked as well. One is that it was done intending to provoke, or this was a bad decision by the EU because they knew it would be provoking Russia, rather than this is a decision by Ukrainian people to go towards the EU and to go towards NATO, and thus by extension annoying the hell out of Putin because he's losing them from his sphere of influence, and that provokes him to attack. Now that's a provocation that I would agree happened, but that's on Putin. That's the thin skin of Putin, and by having a sort of sphere of influence that is very much autocratic or authoritarian, dictatorial, and not thinking about the welfare of all the people involved. I mean, you only have to go to the west of his country to think, would you rather be in the Russian Federation or would you rather be in the EU? EU every day, every time a coconut. Every time a coconut, I would be in the EU rather than the Russian Federation. So that's on him, right? If he's allowed his country to devolve to that state where you've got Georgia rumbling, you've got Ukraine saying we want to go to NATO and the EU, then you know, there you go. It's different from the whole Nigel Farage provoking on purpose. Anyway, we'll continue as the doorbell went and I've lost my train of thought.
The truth is that in America, which is very far away from Ukraine, it works. Here, I think people feel intensely the sense of loyalty to Ukraine. And actually, you know, to be fair, Boris Johnson took on that cause and really pushed Britain to the top of being the Ukraine ally.
And just one other point.
And that's a really good point, that there is this significant difference between the UK and the US. So where Farage really is trying to position himself like the American MAGA in so many ways, we already know he's very close to Trump and he's going to be campaigning for Trump on the presidential campaign trail. So he is trying to replicate that in the UK. But as Emily Maitlis there says, it doesn't quite fit. Which brings me to another point here, and this is how it doesn't fit, because actually, if you take those ideas and you start being a bit pro-Putin here, and as we've seen with Farage, he's got, you know, those connections to Russia. If you take some of those ideas and put them in certain constituencies in the UK, you're going to come up against a very different reaction that you might expect to meet in, I don't know, the depths of Georgia or somewhere, or wherever it is, or in Texas or somewhere in the US. So Keir Giles here says, those blessed with a long memory might recall the name of the English city of Salisbury, and perhaps even why its inhabitants might have a particular view on Russia and Putin, but not apparently the local parliamentary candidate for Reform Party UK. Now, just to let those remind those who've forgotten, or let those who don't know, Salisbury is this town, it's a city not too far from me, small city that was infamous because the FSB sent 2 agents there to kill Sergei Skripal, who was, as a distant or former KGB agent himself, I believe, was living in Salisbury. Anyway, they came and sprayed Novichok on his doorbell, on his door handle, and then did a runner back to Moscow or back to Russia. And then actually Sergei Skripal and his daughter became very seriously ill. Centre of Salisbury is closed down. They got ill in a Pizza Express, and it was all highly, obviously, controversial. And then the perfume bottle that they had used to spray it, they threw in a bin, and somebody picked up stuff out of the bin who was, you know, didn't have a lot of money or whatever, and then sprayed the perfume on them, and they died, and then another man who was associated with her died. That's how I remember it anyway. So Salisbury, there's a lot of hate for Russia, right? Russia have got onto the streets of Salisbury, caused the city to pretty much close down, and attempted to assassinate people, and did indeed kill people on the streets of Salisbury, much like Litvinenko in London previously. So our experience of Russia collectively as a nation, and in certain areas of the the UK is perhaps quite different from the US, where you've got a lot of the MAGA crowd seem to be okay with saying Putin's fine. Now, when you've got Nigel Farage coming along and maybe some of his party members trying to regurgitate these pro-Russian narratives, it doesn't always work. So the Salisbury Journal says here in their article, talking about the candidate for reform UK, the party, Farage's party, quote, "I've actually met Putin," says a candidate, "and had a 10-minute chat with him, and he seemed very good. He's not the Austrian gentleman with a moustache come alive again." In other words, don't worry, guys, he's not Hitler. Putin seems fine. I met him for 10 minutes. Lovely guy. Really? Anyway, boos and looks of disgust were directed towards Mr. Malins, who does not live in Salisbury, so has been parachuted in, one would think, after he made this statement. The 74-year-old continued, quote, "War is not about, as it were, punishing or in some way running over thousands of young men in tanks and blowing them up because one person takes points of view which you disagree with. That is what the adults in the room do, stop the killing and negotiate a proper settlement." So it's this Russian appeasement policy that seems to be coming through in some of the candidates for reform, which is, we need to be making sure they have peace, forcing peace, which is what Trump and his team have come out with again in the last 24 hours, which is a very pro-Russian appeasement, forced negotiation scenario. Anyway, a member of the public who has housed 2 Ukrainian refugees for the last 2 years then accused Mr. Malins of being out of touch. She said, "I can't believe what I've just heard. How can you, in Salisbury, where we had Novichok on our streets, say that?" And so I think there is this difference, and I think it is more difficult for Farage to take an American MAGA-style model and put it into UK. But I think in general, we are moving that direction. We've seen the Conservative Party move that way into a populist right, and the reaction against the Conservatives is often from an even more populist right. So there are elements where that is well received, but the point here, and we'll go on to this in my next video we'll look at. The point is that is poor strategizing from Farage, and he's doubled down. He wrote a piece in the Telegraph where he doubled down on his claims of EU and NATO expansionism.
Point on all of this is that when we went to Clacton a couple of weeks ago for the
Clacton is where Farage himself is running as a constituency and is likely to win.
Launch of Nigel Farage's campaign, and he stood on that bar table and he made the speech about how the fact of the decline of Britain could be seen in that people weren't venerating the heroes of D-Day and aiming at Rishi Sunak and all the rest of it. Look, he doesn't talk about what D-Day was about, which was about to stop the spread of Nazism, to stop the spread of nationalism across Europe, fascism. The sort of things that he is now saying, well, don't poke the Russian bear. Should we have poked the Nazi bear when it was going into the Sudetenland and Poland? I just think that Nigel Farage is very selective in the bits of history he wants to teach us.
But I think that the reception.
John Sopel is so on point there. We've said so many times, haven't we, that this is the whole kind of Russian appeasement. Oh, you can have Donbass, it's okay, you won't take any more, will you? And we'll let you have that, as if we get to decide what parts of Ukrainians give up to Russia in some kind of forced peace negotiation, which is basically what your reform chap there was insinuating, and what Farage, I think, would advocate for. Like, we get to decide that. I mean, it's outrageous, but it is just a parallel from what happened at the beginning of the Second World War. And yet Nigel Farage would be the first person to talk about the Blitz spirit and how wonderful the British were at taking out those horrible Nazi fascists. By the way, Farage at school was called a fascist by his teachers, one of his teachers. So there you go.
Separate things going on here, right? Because he could say, and it is interesting. I mean, I do think this is notable and interesting because it is the first time that a major British political figure has contested the consensus which has basically existed across politics, and that includes Labour, Conservative, SNP, Lib Dem, right across, which is basically that British support for Ukraine should be unequivocal and full-throated. Because although Farage is not saying explicitly that we should withdraw support, it is that logical corollary of what he's saying. He is the only major British political figure who's basically saying that the war in Ukraine is at a stalemate. Now, the guy wants to be Prime Minister, right? That's what he says. So if he thinks that
the war is at a stalemate, it logically implies that our military support should be lessened. I think that the thing is, he might find himself on slightly more fertile ground arguing that than the territory in which he is choosing to fight, which is basically to stick to the line that it was EU and NATO expansionism which provoked the war in Ukraine. And although there will be some people who might argue and have argued that expansionism is an indirect cause, what it does is to shift the burden of culpability onto the EU and onto NATO and onto those sovereign states. Because the point I don't think Farage is reckoning with is the point that you've alluded to, John, which is that ultimately, and Farage sort of acknowledges himself in that in his piece, the biggest supporter of state sovereignty is supposed to be Nigel Farage, right? He believes in national sovereignty. I've never understood the Putin apologism or the sort of defence of what has happened in one sense, which is that it always undermines and fails to acknowledge the state sovereignty of all of those Eastern European states. And frankly, if Ukraine had joined NATO and had been allowed to accede, I mean, who knows what would have happened, but it's certainly true to say that they would have been in a different position today. And if those countries, Poland and the Eastern European states, weren't in NATO today, would Russian tanks be in Tallinn, Riga and Warsaw?
Look,
it's entirely
today,
credible to believe
to clarify.
What an incredibly good point, which is, we talked about this before, some of you have mentioned this a lot, which is, had Ukraine been in NATO, it wouldn't have been invaded. Had those Eastern European countries not been in NATO, had the Baltics not been in NATO, would they have already been invaded? So that NATO expansionism, if you want to call it that, has been absolutely jolly good for those countries. That's another way of looking at it. Really important. But there was a point that was sort of half made that I think the other analysis we're going to look at comes onto, which is that the sorts of people who generally support reform and Nigel Farage are people that are very much into British nationalism, proud of our traditions, proud of our armed forces. There'll be a lot of armed forces people, veterans and serving people who would be very much in favour of Reform UK. But those people have actually a pretty good grasp of the Ukrainian conflict and are broadly very much in support of Ukraine. I don't think it's like in the US has a massive armed forces, and you get quite a political spectrum in the armed forces in the US, and you probably got quite a lot of views. We know that there have been some of these people in the armed forces over there who have, like Donbass Davushka and people like that, who have ended up being Putin apologists online and all that kind of thing. But I think generally speaking, the UK, much smaller armed forces, but just I think they're more unified in their support. We're involved firsthand in training Ukrainian soldiers. If you're going to start giving this pro-Putin approach to your politics and start blaming the EU and NATO, when much of your demographic, much of your electorate that you're hoping to have vote for you has probably connections to the armed forces, then you're probably making a strategic error there.
He said he has not defended President Putin and he would not defend President Putin. So I think you can see from that actually he is at a crossroads of what he's actually trying to say here. I don't think he knows. And I think it goes back to your point, which is that it's all very well standing on a soapbox and sort of declaring things. As soon as you're interrogated, as soon as you actually sit down and have to explain your policies to somebody one-on-one in a lengthy interview situation, you unravel pretty quickly.
But I think it's more than that with Farage. I think he cannot retreat from his own positions. So that is the rigidity.
Well, he's doubled down, but also he's added this extra line, which is that he's not defending. So,
well, to be fair, he would say in his own line that he has never defended Putin personally. He's just acknowledged.
Can I just pick up on this? It may seem a really semantic point, but you were talking about expansionism. Has the EU and NATO expanded? Yes. Did they have an expansionist policy?
So what I was saying earlier.
The fact that we've now got Finland and Sweden in NATO
but
is a direct consequence.
Arguably after the Ukraine war, of course.
It's a direct consequence. They have asked to join.
No, you could say, I think, when the wall fell after '89, of course it expanded because it took in all those Soviet satellite countries that were then not protected. I mean, that they were free.
Putin did see that as a humiliation. There's no doubt about that. He saw the Soviet. Putin thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a disaster, and he saw these former Soviet states joining the West, and he and other members of the former Soviet elite thought it was a humiliation. Okay, he did think that.
But it doesn't naturally follow from that he has the right, or indeed that he's provoked, to invade other countries to try and compensate.
I think part of...
And then that goes back to that point I was making about the definition of provocation being provoked there. But it's exactly right. This is a really solid analysis from these guys.
The problem is that Farage, his top line is basically they're all the same. Therefore, QED, he has to sound like he's not the same. And therefore, he has to say something different, even if it's something that is actually not going to make life particularly easy for him and the Mail. And I do want to get onto this position of the Daily Mail, because the Mail have really championed the idea...
Okay, to give you the context of where we're going next with this. So then what happened is that the Daily Mail wrote about how... Farage has been sort of parroting pro-Putin stuff and took the side of, say, a more traditional conservative political positioning, right? So Farage has been he's been this idol for the Daily Mail for a long time. But now we've got to the situation where Farage has divided the Conservative Party so vehemently, so hugely. The Daily Mail is trying to work out where its loyalty should lie, with the Conservative Party or with these upstart reformists. And I think they said, right, okay, not too sure about this now, and that sounds really rather pro-Putin. So they've gone down the criticise Farage route, which is very interesting. And then Farage has hit back at the Daily Mail. And also, so what happened is the political parties, all the political parties trashed Farage, because actually, if you look at all of these people, Farage and Reform are the enemies of all of these parties, politically speaking. And, from an ideological point of view, from the left, from Labour, Lib Dem, Green, SNP and Plaid Cymru, and from the Tories, from a right challenging them for their seats. So everyone piled on to Farage, but I think for the right reasons, called them out. But one person that called him out was, interestingly, Boris Johnson, our former Prime Minister, who was one of the biggest supporters of Ukraine at the beginning of the war. We know that. He's a huge supporter of Ukraine. However, Farage, quite correctly, called him out on that. Where do I have that? And during a speech, had these massive... So he then went and gave some speeches over the last couple of days and had these big either billboard type things or on a screen of Boris Johnson blaming the EU for Russia's 2014 attacks back in 2014. And this is fascinating because we have Boris Johnson, a massive supporter of Ukraine, actually advocating the same arguments that Farage has been advocating over the last few days, way back then. And the question is, oh my goodness, did that happen? Yes, it did happen. Why did it happen? And there's some interesting analysis on that. It's just fascinating political shenanigans going on in the UK at the moment.
Yeah, of a Tory who is more Tory than any Tory you've ever seen before, right? Nigel Farage has been the epitome of their right-wing Tory for so long, precisely because he wasn't in power. And now I think... there's that sense they're suddenly getting cold feet. They're suddenly thinking,
the Daily Mail,
what are we doing? He's great. We all know he's great for copy. He's great to get people clicking. He's great to get your column shown. But does the Mail really want to be the paper that puts Farage right at the centre of British political life? And I think they're having absolute cold feet about that.
Well,
now.
This is the thing, right? The Mail and other right-wing newspapers have long found Farage to be a very useful tool, an instrument, and it's been a very mutually profitable relationship between the two sides, because they've wanted to see on all manner of issues the Conservative Party move to a position to the right that Farage has embodied, right? And that's been fine, and it's happened again and again,
but
particularly
within the system of a Conservative Party. That's the difference.
But not to the point which they now fear, and which I know Farage's team, they think that the reason that they have gone, the Mail has gone for Farage in this way, is because Rothermere and the owners of the Mail and others are terrified that the Daily Mail is terrified the Conservative Party is going to be destroyed. And what they don't want is for the happy Farage to be the tool, to be the instrument to get what they want, but they don't want Farage to be the end point of British right-wing politics.
He's meant to be the catalyst. He's not meant to be the solution.
But then you've got the question that arises from exactly that analysis, which is an awful lot of Conservatives on the right were thinking that some sort of rapprochement. But
just before he goes on there, if you're interested in what Farage spells in terms of, or not just Farage, actually, the populist move to the right of the Conservative Party, what that spells for the future, the conservatism and I guess that small C conservatism as well as big C conservatism in the UK. As a truly brilliant interview, he speaks quite slowly, so put it on 2x speed, of Peter Oborne. Now, he's a right-wing former Spectator columnist and Telegraph columnist, talking about how the Spectator, the Telegraph, these big bastions of the right-wing media landscape have morphed into populist entities, and how true conservatism, he goes back to talk about Burke and Oakeshott and these old philosophically conservative thinkers, how that era of conservatism, Thatcherism even, and the belief in the conservation of these political ideals and even institutions, how the kind of this newfound populism is trying to blast all that out of the water and is actually not conservative. Really interesting interview that, if because Novara Media is avowedly left wing and Peter Oborne is avowedly right wing, and it's just a brilliant meeting of minds, Aaron Bastani and Peter Oborne there. Really fascinating interview, how the political landscape is truly changing, and what we're seeing here with Nigel Farage and this whole Ukraine-Russia war connection to Putin, but also with immigration, is that tension between this new populism and old school conservatism, where you have some people going, yeah, I'm with you on all this kind of populist stuff, but I'm still holding on to the idea that our military institutions are on the right track, and so on and so forth. And yeah, I just find that all pretty fascinating.
Between Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage is the future of conservatism, and now they are at each other's throats about who is more morally degenerate than each other. Mirror,
it's
mirror on the wall.
It's a great question, isn't it, to be asking the population who is more morally repugnant, Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson?
Exactly. And so you've now got a situation where, who is going to come to the rescue of the right of the Conservative Party at the end of it? And the question I've been mulling over the past few days is Nigel Farage the flame that the Conservative moths flutter towards? Or is he the moth that flutters towards the Conservative Party? And it's very hard to see either going near each other now as a result of this.
Because the big picture, I guess, if you step back, is that the Mail and Boris Johnson and Farage can all be part of, as I said, the circular firing squad. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is being asked questions about which Taylor Swift song he likes. I mean, if there is a genie, it is working overtime for Keir Starmer right now. You could not have aligned the stars better for this election campaign than to have the three people that you might have most feared all at each other's throats, leaving you clear entry to appear with superstars chatting about the lyrics of a song. I mean, you could not make that up.
I am the genie. I grant you 3 wishes, Sir Keir. Well, 1, I'd have the Tory party campaign falling to pieces. 2, I'd have Nigel Farage entering the race and causing ructions within the Conservative Party. And 3, I guess, Scotland going out of the Euros early, so there's no feel-good factor in Scotland that might help the SNP.
He'd never say
Just
that.
between him and the genie.
And that's before you get onto the betting scandal. That's before you get onto, any of the other
Prime
stuff.
Minister insulting D-Day.
So, you've got for those who aren't involved with UK politics, you've got a complete destruction of the Conservative Party alongside of this. There's a betting scandal. So what's happened as well is that Rishi Sunak called an early election, and then loads of people concerned with either his immediate team or other politicians have been found out for betting on that. So the insider trading, if you like, insider knowledge, and that they have now been investigated, but they haven't been suspended, whereas other people who got in trouble previously have been suspended. So that why have they not been suspended? And then so on and so forth. There's just... You couldn't imagine this going any worse for the Conservative Party. Anyway, then we're going to go to the Daily Telegraph. So this is a right-wing podcast here, talking about what's going on between Boris Johnson and Farage.
He's in tune with a significant chunk of the electorate, but anything that can be construed as being pro-Putin is not going to renew any support.
It's really weird, this, because I spoke to Kwasi Kwarteng about this yesterday.
Former
and
Treasurer,
he was saying
Chancellor
this
of the
just sounds
Exchequer
cranky.
for 42 days.
I get the whole, I'm very honest, I'm upfront, I'm going to just say what I believe and I'm not going to shy away from it. And that really appeals to his kind of what I would call reform fanboys and girls, the people on X who are vociferously supporting his positioning. But at the same time, that's not good enough, is it? If he wants reform to be above that average poll rate of, I think it's 17% at the moment, he's got to be appealing to moderate Tories. I don't know about you, but I've spoken to a number of moderate Tories, and this actually came up in the leader meeting earlier, where a number of our colleagues were saying, yeah, I've had a few people contact me to say, I was going to support reform, and now he said this, I'm not going to, because this is not aligned with my thinking. I'm a Thatcherite. I support sort of Reagan on foreign policy. I support the Boris approach to Ukraine, which has been pretty robust, let's be honest.
Yep.
People say that was like one of the highlights of his premiership. This is a complete departure from this sense of fairness. It's really nuanced, though, Gordon. I mean,
that is interesting, particularly because I've had people reach out to me on the threads below the videos where I've talked about Farage, who have said, I was going to vote for reform, but now he said this on Ukraine, I'm not going to vote for them. Who do I vote for now? Because they're disaffected Conservative voters. I would say, don't vote for reform. Whatever you do, vote for either Conservative or don't vote at all, or whatever. I don't think we should give oxygen to someone who's pro-Putin. Call me simplistic, but this is, I think, a serious strategic blunder for Farage. And indeed, on the Jeremy Vine show, we have Gemma Forty here talking about this issue.
Whose side would you take?
I think this is one of the most grotesque sights ever. You've got two morally repugnant human beings. You've got a Putin apologist versus a Russian asset, basically, squabbling it out.
Hang on, which is which? Help
Boris Johnson. Well, Farage is being both, really.
Oh, I see. So the Russian asset is Boris.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you remember when he got paid, what was it, 160 grand to play tennis with the wife of a Russian minister, right? And
so people forget that Boris Johnson, there was a worry at the beginning of the Ukraine war that and you could take this back to 2014 even, that the UK wouldn't be strong enough against Russia because actually Londongrad is called that because it's laundered so much Russian money. The Russian influence within conservative politics particularly is really considerable, and it's been evidenced, and you can talk about Lebedev that they're going to go on to talk about in a second, but there have been these big connections explicitly between Boris Johnson, and so where you have Boris Johnson back in 2014 talking about his positioning on the Ukraine crisis back in 2014 and his positioning now, there's a really big difference, but back then there was just all this Russian influence swirling around London.
And he let Russian donations from very powerful oligarchs flood into the Conservative Party.
But
you're correct, in 2014...
To interrupt, isn't this ideal for you? Because you've got two people that you really, really don't like, knocking seven bells out of each other.
Yeah, but it's also, I feel sad. I mean, I don't enjoy these kind of grubby sights because I actually still love living here, and it's embarrassing. And the hypocrisy of Johnson. In 2014, as you say, he said exactly the same thing about Russia invading Ukraine. And the thing with Johnson, he does what suits him in that moment. So it suited him, and it was good, his support for Ukraine, absolutely. It's one thing you could say that he did well, but the motivation at the heart of anything with Johnson is Johnson. And, you know, they're both, as you say, whacking seven bells at each other. This is the perfect time to publish the unredacted Russia report. Let's have a look at that. Let's go back to when Johnson was mayor or whatever he was at the time, and foreign secretary, and he went off to the Lebedev villa for one of the lavish parties, lost his security, was pictured hungover, bedraggled sight in the airport. The next thing we know, this very powerful oligarch who was in the KGB, his son is being put by Johnson into the House of Lords where he remains. Evgeny Lebedev, the Baron of Siberia.
Wow.
So this argument that Johnson has a leg to stand on is for the birds.
Boom, drop mic. So yes, Johnson was strong on Ukraine, but there were serious worries that he wouldn't be, precisely because of all these facts of the matter, that he has been hobnobbing with Russian oligarchs, that he made a Russian oligarch's son a lord in the House of Lords, where he remains, Evgeny Lebedev, and just absolutely incredible. But he did eventually make the right decision. But again, is that because it was politically useful for him to do so? Because if you remember at the time, at the beginning of the war, Boris Johnson was tanking in the polls. He was getting ripped apart for Partygate, for the COVID rules that he broke himself with people around him. And so he was getting hammered in the press. And so he decided to possibly to put all his eggs in the Ukraine basket, which did give him some public support from outside of the UK in Ukraine, and a little bit of a bump internally as well, but it wasn't enough to save him. But you could argue that everything that Boris, as she did, that everything that Boris Johnson has done, very much in the populist mould of Donald Trump, has been to the benefit of Boris Johnson. And the whole thing is just a shambles, really. But I think, it's good that Boris Johnson did eventually make the decisions he did, but Farage now parroting those pro-Russian appeasement lines, I think that's exceptionally dangerous, and I'm definitely not a fan of that. Anyway, that should hopefully give you enough of an overview of what's going on. The question that then remains is, how does this play with the electorate? Is this going to be anything that affects that 17%? Will that play in Conservative favour? Will you just have disaffected Reform voters who don't turn up to vote? That it might not make a huge difference because they're not on course to take many seats, because it's about first past the post. At 17% in each different constituency is not enough to get you over that line. Even though you might have 17% of the national vote, you'll probably end up with 5 MPs rather than 85 MPs, or however many 17% of 650 is. This is our broken electoral system, but in this case, Reform are going to be super angry about not having proportional representation after this election, and I wonder whether Labour will have to deal with clamouring for a change of our electoral system. Anyway, that's my tuppence. Hopefully that makes sense to you and is interesting. It's interesting to me, which is why I just spent an hour talking about it. Let me know what you think about this. Take care, guys, and I'll speak to you soon.